Welcome to this Gallery Teachers Masterclass. I'm Luke Meddings, and we're going to be looking at how to make space in the classroom for unplugged or spontaneous or responsive teaching, and how this kind of work in the classroom relates to the linear syllabus. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone at Gallery Teachers for inviting me to give this session, which is in fact the first of 3 sessions. And as well as thanking them for asking me to give this workshop and the following 2, I'd like to ask and hopefully thank you for giving me some input in between the sessions. I've got a task for you, which I hope will be interesting and which will lead on from everything that we talk about today. So the title for the series of workshops is Lines and Paths, Circles and Spheres. And it's all about how we use space in the outside world and what we can learn from that in terms of what we do in the classroom. But it's going to be very practical in terms of looking at our classroom practice and thinking of ways that we can perhaps expand it and do things differently. And the first of those sessions today, and our part 1, is called Lines and Paths. Now, my background is essentially that I was a teacher for many years. And after some time, I became involved in the Dogme ELT movement, I guess it's called, and then wrote with Scott Thornbury a book called Teaching Unplugged. And we identified 3 key principles in Teaching Unplugged, which are that lessons should be conversation driven, that they should be materials light, and that they should be focused on emergent language. The idea here is that if we give our students more space to contribute and more time to talk, then conversation and interaction, it could be via messages, it could be via notes written on paper, becomes the motor of what happens in our classroom, and the role of materials then becomes a smaller one. Notice that we say materials light, we don't say there should be no materials. And as we'll see, I've come to think a lot about how this kind of work can be blended with the syllabus and the coursework. And then finally, what I always think is the biggest challenge in Teaching Unplugged is working with emergent language. So that's where this part of my education career began, with the publication of this book about just over 10, 11 years ago now. And as a result of it, I was asked to give talks and train in a number of different countries, which was fascinating because I got to talk to people who were both interested by these ideas and had lots of questions about them, which meant that I learned more about all these thoughts and ideas. So I want to look at 2 quite kind of black and white depictions of what linear teaching and unplugged teaching look like. I would think of linear teaching as orthodox, conventional teaching. It's pretty much the teaching that we see in our schools and in our education systems worldwide as the norm. So lessons are planned in advance. There is extensive use of course books and published materials, which means that the content is very top-down. And the timing of these lessons is often very precise. So they're planned in advance, and the timing within the lesson itself is sometimes, if you look at teachers' lesson plans, timed by not just the 5 minutes, but by the 2 minutes or the 1 minute. These are some of the effects of linear teaching. Unplugged teaching essentially proposes something quite different, and in its purest form, the opposite. So by making our students the heart of what happens in the classroom, content starts to be bottom up instead of top down. So we're providing less content and generating with the students more of our own content. So the themes are bottom up. That means that the language also is bottom up. So instead of the focus being mainly on planned exponents, we need to observe the language that comes up in class. And instead of planning for all of that, because we can't anticipate everything that emerges from natural interaction, we need to instead think about mapping it during the lesson and afterwards. In other words, making sense of the language that has emerged and making decisions about what to focus on, both in the moment and after the lesson. Because both of those aspects introduce more, if you like, uncertainty into the planning process and certainly into the lesson timings, we need to be flexible. It's impossible to teach in a way that is all about bottom-up content and emergent language with extremely fixed timings. So we need to be flexible. Now, we still work within whatever time we're given in a lesson, and we still need to think in terms of pacing, and we may well be, as the next slide implies, blending Unplugged with linear teaching. But we need to learn to be flexible, and we need to argue the case for flexibility in our planning and timings. Now, of course, most of us work in systems where we can't simply decide what we do and when we do it. We work within the broad curriculum that's set by the government. We work to a syllabus, which is very often expressed in a course book. And so what I'd propose as a kind of practical model, if you like, at this point is a blend where we try and ensure that we make enough space for unplugged teaching, even if we're teaching to a linear syllabus, even if we're using a course book, even if there's an exam on the horizon, so that we plan the lesson, but we plan it flexibly, we build in enough time for spontaneous interaction, and we make sure that we also map what happens when that spontaneous interaction occurs, both in terms of themes and content that emerge bottom up, so to speak, from the people in the room, and in terms of specific language points that we might want to address either in the moment or later. But this model allows for the fact that there's going to be top-down content, broadly speaking, from the curriculum, and probably quite specifically from a syllabus in a course book, which may well relate to an exam. But that idea of being flexible in timing, ironically, is kind of non-negotiable. We cannot plan minutely for what's going to emerge naturally. All of which takes us outside the classroom now, and to a very interesting example of, I guess, what digital creators and engineers would call user choice. This picture was taken in a park in a town called Tunbridge Wells, not far from where I grew up, in Sussex, in England, in the UK. And what it shows is something that's so familiar to us as we walk around that we may not notice it, we may not be conscious of it. What it shows us is an example of the built environment on the left of the picture, where you can see a paved path, and leading off into the center of the picture and beyond, what we know as a desire path. It's a path that reflects the choice of the people using the park to go in a different direction, to get to a different destination, maybe to get there more quickly, maybe to enjoy the trees that lie in between. As we can see, it's not entirely random, it's merely an alternative. So the paved path on the left may be broader, it might be a better choice in wet weather, but the path that has emerged naturally from where people choose to walk is not actually a myriad of different paths, it's also a single path. And so there's a straightforward choice for the walker here. There's an interesting article on the Guardian website, which I've linked to in the notes, and where I found this picture, and the next one you're going to see. Designers, whether it's in the digital world or in the architectural or indeed interior design worlds, are really interested in desire paths. There's a nice quote from a professor in interior design and architecture at a Canadian university. His name is Andrew Furman, who, the article tells us, has spent years looking at desire lines. And in his view, they tell us something about the endless human desire to have choice, the importance of not having someone prescribe your path. And that, I think, resonates with me as an educator. I think it tells us something about what we can find in our classrooms, but also what we might be denying, which is the desire of the people involved to have their needs and their choices reflected in our lesson design. So that's a desire path. It's a very simple example of one. And perhaps as you walk around your environment, both in urban paths and urban parks and more rural areas, you'll see many examples of these. So it says something about choice. And within that, it says something about intention, not just about wanting to be able to do something different because we feel like it, but about having different needs, about wanting to get to a different place in a different way. This illustration is also taken from the Guardian article that I've linked to in the notes. And it shows us desire paths that have emerged in the grounds surrounding the National Congress of Brazil in Brasilia. Now, I think this is particularly interesting as a location because Brasilia is one of the most designed cities in the world. It was essentially founded and then quickly built in and from 1960. From the air, it has in its main highways and layout the shape of an aeroplane, a kind of symbol of the future. So it is literally an architectured city. It's a designed city. But what's interesting about this photo, of course, is that human intention, human choice, human need needs to coexist with design. And you can see that network of paths that cross the green space between the roads. So that has arisen from, not long before I was born, around 60 years ago. This would have been completely new land. It wouldn't have had these paths, and they've emerged in ways that can both be clearly seen and in ways that are not entirely random. They reflect intention, but we can read what people are trying to do. And it's interesting that they form a kind of informal crossroads in the middle of that space at the front of the picture, where 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 of those paths intersect almost as a meeting area, which is developed in a space where the car is dominant and where it would have been hard to meet people on foot. In other words, desire paths emerge naturally, and they emerge pretty quickly. They reflect human choice, they reflect human intention, but they don't wind up as a complete mess. They have a kind of logic of their own. Desire paths, and I'm quoting again from that Guardian article, have been described as illustrating, and I quote, the tension between the native and the built environment and our relationship to them. And they're described here as a kind of feedback that is being given by the people who live in a city to the urban planners. By choosing to walk here, by forming paths and then following them, people are telling the urban planners things about their movement and about their needs and their priorities. So because of this idea of feedback on the ground and of iterative design, you'll find that, again, digital creators and engineers are really interested in desire paths, and they can trace them from how people interact in online environments. You may be asking quite how this relates to our work in the classroom. And I'd like to propose an answer and a model here. It struck me looking at this picture that the road kind of in and out of the city centre is a nice analogy for our objectives as educators and our outcomes. Now, often these are closely linked, one might almost say wedded, bound together in the lesson plan. We state our objectives and we also state what the outcomes are going to be. And there's not very much room for what emerges naturally from the interactions. And when I say what emerges naturally, I'm not talking about a kind of whimsical, I want to do something completely different. I'm talking about people naturally using different ways to get to the same place, which is again why I find these pictures so interesting. In our model, the center space here, the green space where those paths have been created, represents what is in terms of what is actually happening. It's that feedback from the user. And in our context, that could be things that they want to say. In other words, we could set an activity where we're asking people to use quite a limited number of exponents. We might ask them to use one or two, perhaps just one verb form, and to practice it. But if we allow people to speak naturally, even if we give them a topic and a theme, our thought wanders. It doesn't always stay within one verb form. It doesn't naturally gather around a narrow set of vocabulary exponents. It kind of goes off in different directions. And that's the what could be in the classroom. If we listen to what's happening in those moments and we ask ourselves, what are the learners trying to do here? What's my role? Should I be giving them the instruction they need in order to do this right now? Should I return to it tomorrow? Or, in my judgment as the teacher, is what they're trying to do actually too difficult for them? So this is going to be our focus. If you like, the roads, the built environment, the objectives and the outcomes, and all the kind of traffic, educational traffic around that is preset for most of us, unless we're extremely independent in our teaching location or perhaps teaching one-to-one. We won't have complete freedom. But what can we do between the lines? That's going to be our focus. So just to be clear, we're going to be most interested, and this is where I'm going to ask you to focus in your classroom practice between the first and the second sessions in our series of 3, on the themes that emerge naturally in classroom interaction and the language that comes out of that interaction. So the bottom-up content and the kind of mapping that we do. On a very simple level, the mapping can be just making a note of things. But then it starts to be a case of trying to see where all this stuff is going. What are the patterns that we can observe in the classroom interaction? And that can help us then to teach more responsively and to perhaps introduce items that are not immediately scheduled in the syllabus sooner rather than later. But there's something else that happens in the classroom which will be familiar to all language teachers, and I'm sure many other teachers as well. And that's that learners don't just reach forward to elements which have not yet been covered in the syllabus. They also slip back quite a lot. And so we find that while we might have finished units 1, 2, 3, and in our heads at least covered off the content and the language points in those units, it's not that simple. We know that as teachers. And thinking in this area sort of reminded me of a game I used to play as a kid, and which some of you may have played as children or with your own kids, which I think is kind of a nice, quite a light, but quite a telling analogy for the language classroom. And that's a game called Snakes and Ladders. Now, the idea of snakes and ladders is that although there's a goal, which is to get from square one to square, I'm peering at this now, I think that's in this version of the game, it seems to be square 144. And there's a way of getting there, which is to roll dice. Everything else is up to chance. It's not a game of strategy. It's a game that exists in the moment. And what happens in Snakes and Ladders is that you roll your dice and you move the number of spaces indicated. And then if you land on a ladder, you get a shortcut to further up the board. But if you land on the head of a snake, then you have to come down again. And you can see that there are at least 2 snakes in that very top row. So someone who's about to win the game by landing on the final square mark game might land instead on box or square number 135 or 142 and be kind of not quite back to square one, but they'd have to go a long way back down the board towards the beginning. Now, the point here is that these are both things that happen in our classrooms. And if we are too stuck to a linear syllabus, it's hard to attend to either of them. The ladders are the desire paths that we've been talking about. The times when people find that in conversation, I'm talking about students now, they can't stay within the limits of whatever language exponents they've been asked to use, and they reach for other forms. They might be forms that they've been exposed to in the past. They might be forms that, in theory, haven't yet been taught. However, when we're teaching a second language, I think sometimes we imagine that our learners are less mentally equipped than they already are, because our learners all already know how to think in language. And so even if they find they can't express something in English, they still know what they're looking for because the form is available to them from their first language. So if you like, the desire paths, the ladders in this instance, represent the language of thought. It's, what am I trying to say? I think I might be able to say it in English this way. I know that I can say it in that way in another language. So that's where the ladders and the desire paths come into play in the classroom. And the snakes we're all familiar with. So if you find yourself teaching students of different levels at different times of a day or across a week, you'll be very familiar with finding yourself perhaps teaching a form, often happens with verb forms, to a beginner or elementary or an intermediate class, and then finding that students in your advanced class, while more fluent in some areas, are struggling with the same form. And they've kind of landed on the head of a snake and they've slipped back a bit in their production. So what's in play as we think about what happens when classroom interactions bottom up, when we think about mapping emergent language, is the language of thought. It's our learners' freedom, their choice, their intention, what they want to say, and also their limits, how we really learn. There's a nice quote here from Diane Larson Freeman, which tells us, I think, formally what we all know informally as teachers. And I quote, "Learning linguistic items is not a linear process. Learners do not master one item and then move on to another. In fact, the learning curve for a single item is not linear either. The curve is filled with peaks and valleys, progress and backslidings." That's pretty much what you get in the game of snakes and ladders. Following this train of thought, I started to link the idea of a game to conversation. Conversation is an exchange. It's more unpredictable than a game because there isn't a specific goal involved. But critically, it involves these variables that we can't control. In a game of snakes and ladders, it's the ladders and the snakes, and to some extent, the roll of the dice. In conversation, it's not just in a second language, the limitations of our knowledge or our ability to express it. It's also what the other people do. That's what makes conversation fascinating. That's what makes it a vital part of the language classroom. And that's why teaching Unplugged is an extremely practical approach to ELT tuition, because it brings in the dynamic of unpredictable interaction, which is exactly the one that our learners experience when they're outside the classroom. It's getting to grips with the idea that we can't prepare our learners for real-world language use simply by drilling them on items one by one, day after day, week after week. They have to learn how to put it together freely as they express thoughts in real time, if you like. And they also need to learn how to react to the people around them in the way that that changes the dynamic of a conversation. So the win to teaching Unplugged, the win to following the desire paths, attending to what students want to say, need to say, are trying to say, and also paying attention to what they kind of keep getting wrong and where they need some extra work or some revision and potentially some more drilling and anti-drilling. What we're giving them is a realistic challenge inside the classroom, which will prepare them for the challenge outside the classroom. I've also linked to an interesting article which talks about, from a teacher's point of view, their experience of the limitations of a linear syllabus, finding that students kind of keep making the same mistakes, and looking at the limitations of prescribing what has to be learned compared with exploring what emerges naturally. Pursuing the idea of game, and this kind of emerged from my research into this talk. I started looking for articles about linear and non-linear teaching. You know what it's like when you Google, you go linear versus non-linear, then you add teaching, then you try pedagogy, maybe methodology. And what kept coming up was the use of non-linear pedagogy in sport. And this is all about contrasting constant repetitive drills, teaching people the micro skills they need to play a game, such as football, let's say a team sport, with the dynamic of the fluid situation in an actual game and the way they need to respond to that. And a very nice analogy is, if you think about the way that children or school kids, professionals even, train on a football pitch, they often use cones. They look a little bit like the playing markers in the on the snakes and ladder board, and they dribble around the cones. Of course, the cones are static, and no one ever encounters a cone on a football pitch in a real life situation, in an actual game. Similarly, no one encounters a drill or a gap fill or the chance to introduce the same verb form into 3 similar locations in a real life conversation. We need to prepare students for the game of conversation. A quote from an article we'll return to in the next session says that non-linear pedagogy suggests that practice task constraints should be designed to stimulate the constraints of the actual performance environment. That's about sports teaching, PE teaching, and I think it's really relevant to our work as well. All right, we're almost there with this session, and I want to return to the idea of desire paths and what we can learn from them, and that idea of using them as a source of feedback, a kind of rolling, a kind of constant needs analysis. This is a picture of Michigan State University taken from the air. What's interesting about Michigan State University, and you can find this in that Guardian article, which I've linked to in the notes, is that they chose not to put in pavements when they built the new campus. So they built the buildings, they made the space, but they waited for students to create their own paths. And in a sense, the buildings, in our case, are the curriculum, the syllabus, the course book, the exam. The space between them, though, has the potential to be much more organic, much more responsive to student needs and intentions. So I'd like to give you a task to carry out before our next session. And it's to really pay attention to desire paths in the classroom and to the moments where students seem to be struggling with things they should, in theory, already know. So this is a task that I'd invite you to try out over the next few weeks. I'd like you to think about and pay attention to the snakes and ladders, to the desire paths, to what students are reaching for and where they're slipping back. The best way to do this, I find, is to extend the space for conversation in the classroom. Now, it might be a case of simply letting a warmer run a bit longer, but it might be a case of setting quite a simple task or activity and then just seeing how much you can get out of it. One of my favorites is simply to ask people what they had for breakfast, to get them to compare with someone next to them, and then to compare in groups so that you're generating lots of natural conversation. You're not telling them what language to use. Listen into those conversations. You'll find all sorts of interesting stuff coming out. And it may not be simply a range of vocabulary to describe food. And it certainly won't be limited to one verb form. So that's a particular favorite of mine. What did you have for breakfast? It might be, what's the nicest thing you've had to eat or drink over the last 24 hours? Everyone can join in. You don't need to be asking them to talk about anything fancy. You could say, the best thing I had was a glass of water yesterday because I was super thirsty. So you're setting a very light task for the students, and you're listening to what comes out of it. There might be other moments where things happen spontaneously and you just choose to give them a couple more minutes, a bit more time to see what comes out, maybe prompt a bit more, draw out more conversation. And what I'm specifically interested in for your task is that you start to make a note of the kind of themes that emerge from natural conversation. What do your students really want to talk about, as opposed to what they're told to study or talk about in the course book, and then to the language that they are manipulating as they talk about those emergent themes. And it might be that you can identify things which they should already know, that they've covered in the course book or syllabus, but they're still struggling with. And it might be also that you start to notice, and I'd love you to note this down, what they're trying to say. What forms are they almost using? What does it seem they're trying to express, and what would be the best way in English to do that? You can go to the workshop forum for this session and leave some of your thoughts. Was it an interesting task? Was it worthwhile? I hope it will be. And then perhaps what kind of themes are coming out, because we're all going to be teaching in different environments, teaching in different places, different countries, different age groups, and so on. And then what kind of language did you notice? What did you notice them struggling with? What did you notice them reaching for? Some specific examples would be wonderful. And I'll be taking a look at that. And what I want to do is to use that as your own user feedback and then bring that into the next session and talk about that, and using your perspectives, so that the next session is a bit less top down and a bit more bottom up. It'll use your own feedback. And the final tip, do you remember I told you one of my favorite activities is something really simple? What did you guys have for breakfast? Or what's the nicest thing you've had to eat or drink over the last 24 hours? Don't kind of close the parameters of the activity by saying, I want you to talk about this using the past simple, or I want you to use these 10 words. Don't worry about exponents for this. Open the gate, let them talk, let their thoughts wander in language, and listen to what comes up. And I hope that'll be interesting, and I can't wait to listen to, respond to your questions, and to get more involved in this as we go along. There are loads of great resources on the Gallery Teachers Workshops pages. So if you're looking for more ELT resources, if you're looking for more on CPD, then do look at the link there, follow it through, and see what's on offer.